think I'll do the introductions from up here, and as the panelists come up, I'll join them on the stage. So thank you, Julia, and to your team for having me here today to moderate this panel in what is an energetic room. I've never seen a dance off at a conference like this before. It gives me ideas about our own conference. So I am the CEO of Community Foundations of Canada, and we have typically been an organization that represents community foundations that are quite local in thinking, local leadership, local knowledge, and local expertise. And so we are now making the shift into an organization that is starting to look outwards instead of inwards, or actually we'd be looking both outwards and inwards. And so I'm happy to be a part of this discussion here on the universality of SDGs. And the concept of universality is core to the Sustainable Development Goals and is what differentiates them from the MDGs, which really took a very north-south relationships in terms of its approach to development. And what universality means is really three things. It could mean many more, but for me it means that they apply to everybody, quite simply, regardless of where they live. And that the global challenges that we have transcend national borders. And also that collective action is needed to ensure that those goals are achieved by everyone, everywhere. We heard from Prime Minister Trudeau and the Canadian delegation a few weeks ago at the UNGA, and he talked about the SDGs and addressed the needs of Canadians, the Canadian Indigenous populations, such as poverty reduction, clean water and sanitation, and gender inequality. And of course, the challenges of climate change, which are being felt around the world, here in Canada, and particularly in the Arctic, where warming is 3 times faster in the Arctic than the rest of the country. And just one example of how the SDGs connect into Canada, through our work in communities from coast to coast to coast, we found that there's a strong sense of belonging that's required to the vitality of the communities, regardless of whether you're in rural Canada or in some of our largest cities. And this sense of belonging tends to be challenged by issues like exclusion, unemployment, gender inequality, poverty, and other challenges shared by our country. And this idea of universality means that we all need to tackle these challenges together to ensure that no one is left behind. It is important to note that the success of the SDGs doesn't rest solely on the government, and it's important for the civil society, plural sector, and the corporate world to come together to ensure that we can achieve these important goals. And now, I'd like to welcome the panelists. And I'm pleased to introduce our panelists today. I'd like to first introduce Adam Vaughan, Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Families, Children, and Social Development. Adam, could you please come to the stage? Thank you. And secondly, I'd like to introduce Madame Celina Cesar-Chavin, Parliamentary Secretary for the Minister of International Development. Does that work? Perfect.
Yep.
You're good?
I think they'll switch them.
Oh, they'll switch us
there
off?
We go.
Perfect. Yeah. Boy, from the round of applause, we know who the popular one here is, Adam.
Sorry, Adam.
She hands out more money.
I mentioned the Prime Minister in my opening remarks. And the Prime Minister drew a lot of attention recently by choosing to focus on Canada's historically poor treatment of Indigenous peoples during his speech at the UNGA. Why was it important for the Prime Minister to highlight our domestic failures with respect to Indigenous people in a global platform such as the UNGA? Adam, would you like to go first?
Sure, and first of all, I'd like to acknowledge that we are gathered here today on the unceded territory and the traditional territory of the Algonquin people. And it's important as we do that to deepen recognition to mean a little bit more. And so as part of our practice as politicians now, as we do consultations from place to place across this country, it's more than just leaning into who has been here for a long time. We also have to start to recognize what they're trying to be telling us for a long time. And so to Dr. Deere, I'd like to thank him for his presentation and his generosity with sharing his knowledge. But I'll start by sharing some of the knowledge that elders have shared with us as we go about doing things like creating poverty reduction strategies and new housing programs. One of the things that they talk about are the 7 teachings of the grandfather. And one of the most important teachings is humility. And if we're going to stand on world stages and offer some of the gifts that Canada has to offer to the world, we have to be honest about the failings of Canada as well, and understand our role in a colonial process, understand the racism that's implicit in that, understand the failures to share properly with the land that has been so generous to so many of us, regardless of where we come from or how we arrived. We have to be honest with people. And I think what the Prime Minister is trying to do in acknowledging that is show that this is a better way to move forward. That it's one thing to boast about the values of your country. It's another thing to lead on issues like creating a feminist foreign policy. It's another thing to engage in peacemaking rather than prosecuting wars. And these are good things, and these are Canadian values that have grown out of this country. But we have to be honest. You don't need to go to Iqaluit to see overcrowding and poor housing. You can see it in the east side of downtown Vancouver. You don't need to go to sub-Saharan Africa to see what drought and displacement due to climate change, but also what hunger and poverty looks like due to violent colonialism. You can see that on the streets in downtown Toronto. And if we are going to be serious about delivering a better tomorrow to people right across the planet, we have to be just as serious about doing that in our own country. And that involves coming to terms with our past and being honest about it and frank about it, and then moving forward together towards a new future. And I think that the Prime Minister, when he speaks on the world stage, gets lots of accolades. And it's a little embarrassing at times, quite frankly, because we have to be honest. And that honesty is, I think, what we saw at the UN. It's the honesty we get every day that we talk in caucus about how we have to make progress on all of these issues globally, but locally too.
Thank you, Secretary Vaughan. Secretary Cesar Chavin, would you like to build on those comments?
So first, Selena is fine.
Perfect.
And Adam.
We might just go on and on about trying to figure out the Selena, Cesar Chavin, Secretary, all that stuff. So I appreciate that Adam acknowledged the land that we are on. And I want to sort of rewind a little bit from the Prime Minister and go back to how we developed our feminist international assistance policy. We did a wide consultation around the world, listening to organizations, many of whom are in the room, but also listening to local actors, understanding their challenges, what they would like to see in our policy going forward. We took a year to do that, 65 countries, thousands of submissions, and really put it together in a policy that I'm hoping, and I think based on the reaction, you see yourself in. The listening component of that exercise is critically important. It is our capability to listen and to understand what we need to do in order to be able to meet some of the challenges that we are going to be facing, or to succeed in achieving the 17 SDGs and their related targets. The Prime Minister at UNGA decided to state, I think with his speech, that we're willing to learn. We are willing to listen as well. We do not have this all sorted out. We haven't figured out all of our domestic issues. Clearly there is relationship issues, and I think Dr. Deere just really emphasized some of those. We have our own domestic issues. And in order for us to be partners in the universality of the SDGs, to ensure that everyone, everywhere, and gets what they need, lives to their full potential, and that no one is left behind, we need to have some truth in our approach. And that was really displayed last week at UNGA with the Prime Minister. So he did speak about communities and safe places. So we referred to SDG 11. He referred to gender equality, which we have been doing for quite some time, which is SDG 5. But he really placed that emphasis on our commitment to ensuring that we get our house in order, as well as making sure that we are helping as well.
Thank you, Selena. And I'll pose the next question to you first.
Yes.
There's a lot of momentum around the SDGs gathering here in Canada, particularly in the plural sector and many corporations. What can we expect to see from the government in terms of its future alignment against the SDGs and Agenda 2030?
So I think we're starting to see where we're headed. If I speak from an international development perspective, we clearly outlined that at the heart of what we're going to be doing is women and girls. We placed that SDG 5 right at the center of our feminist international assistance policy, and then surrounded around by 5 other pillars that are critically important. We've matched that or coupled that with a progressive trade policy and foreign policies. And we are going to be, as you know, next year, providing our voluntary statement. So as we developed all of our budgets so far, budget 2016, budget 2017, I think we could have clearly seen little markers of all the SDGs on those various documents. And that sort of set the stage as to where we are going. The minister's mandate letters are clearly integrated into the SDGs. The 2016 to 2019 Federal Sustainable Development Strategy had 13 goals in it that were clearly aligned under the Minister McKenna. Provinces, territories, and municipalities are thinking about how they can integrate the SDGs. So we have started to demonstrate where we are going. It clearly is a priority for Canada to ensure that we fall in line with what our international commitments and making sure that we place the SDGs front and center in the things that we do. I think at this point, I will turn it over to Adam, because I think going forward from a domestic policy perspective, it might fall under your ministry in order to lead the charge into what we do domestically.
Thank you. Adam?
Well, we have to attain those goals domestically, as well as support countries achieving them internationally. And we have, from my perspective, one of the most important things we've done is rethink the way cities and municipalities are engaged in our national dialogue. Historically in Canada, this sort of confederation has been a two-sided table, with the provinces and the federal government sitting across from each other and negotiating most of the development policies and the social policies in this country. We've been very deliberate about changing that to a table with 4 sides, where the Indigenous governments, municipal governments, the provinces, and the federal provinces and territories and the federal government are together. And that sets up an agenda whereby we start to make significant investments very quickly in a number of areas that match the Sustainable Development Goals domestically. For me, the issue that is central to this is housing, and reorientating housing from being a commodity to being a necessity, reorientating it from being an infrastructure investment into a tool that's used to achieve right across the SDG spectrum. So when you think of housing as a tool instead of a goal, what ends up happening is you end up looking at it as more of a model of healthcare than a model of simply of shelter. And that allows us to invest heavily into communities that start to drive change on the social sector side. And you can see that with the impact on mental health, the impact on poverty, the impact on the environment. Most of our greenhouse gas emissions in this country come out of the built form and come out of cities. 3/4 come out of the buildings. When you start building smarter housing, you start building not only great places for people to live and healthier environments to grow up, but you also start making a significant contribution to the reduction of greenhouse gases and creating a sustainable economic model of growth that is both just and smart. And so we've invested heavily across those infrastructures, but we've also recognized that it's more than just simply hard investments, it's also soft investments. And we've started to take a look at poverty in a different way. In fact, we had a conference just around the corner this morning on the very same subject. And taking a look at and again, this, if you haven't reached out into Indigenous communities and sat in presence of elders and listened to worldviews that take subjects that you think you know a lot about and just change them ever so slightly and evolve them ever so much more progressively. There are so many extraordinary lessons that help you really do good public policy by listening to very, very well-entrenched and well-represented wisdoms. And part of the lesson we learned around this, which is also informing our practice as we move forward, is we talked to Inuit elders here in Ottawa about what it would mean to have a poverty reduction strategy and what that would mean for their community in terms of health outcomes and you know, the way in which they have to live in a changing environment up north and down south. And one of the things they said is we don't have a word for poverty. It doesn't exist as a concept in our language. What we talk about is people who lack resiliency. And the SDGs at their core are about creating not only a more resilient economy and a more resilient society, but more resilient people. And so again, when we lean into this on a domestic level, we start pulling those lessons from the ground with people with lived experience, with people with entrenched wisdom, with people with participatory practices that get us to the SDGs, not just because they direct us in a smarter way in terms of where we make hard investments, but they also change the way we think about sustainability and look to those practices to improve the way we do our work as a government. And so it also brings the Inuit elders and the people that are working on that issue inside that community, it brings their policy, their practice into harmony with our policies and our practice. And that's where real reconciliation happens, but it's also where the Sustainable Development Goals become real very fast. And so the domestic program is yes, hard investments, focused efforts on dealing with some you know, very difficult social issues, but it's also about engaging people differently in the solutions and building from that ground up, and then taking those practices and sharing them across the planet.
If I could just add to that, I think, Adam, the last point is really what the SDGs are about. The interconnectivity of the SDGs presents an example for us to work differently, to be more innovative, to work together, to come up with different solutions to be able to meet those challenges. And I believe that our government in its work going forward is going to really look to innovative partnerships to be able to meet these very real challenges, both at a domestic level and at an international level as well.
Thank you. Adam, I just want to go back to an event that both of you actually attended in July, the high-level political forum, and you were there with other leaders, other ministers from around the globe to discuss the implementation of SDGs. Can you offer your reflections on that time, in particular how Canada was implementing in relation to others?
We're coming at this from a standstill. You know, we inherited, in particular around Habitat 3 and the involvement of the urban agenda and its role in developing the SDGs and participating in detailing program. You know, I worked as a city councillor before I came to Ottawa and was involved with people who were working on Habitat 3. And Canada has been absent on this file for the better part of a decade. There was not a lot of, even finding the very few public servants who were working on this file took me about 3 months of knocking on door after door after door. So when we talk about this practice, it's an evolving and a new practice inside government right now. And so it's in some ways exciting, but it's also very frustrating because I think there's 10 lost years there. But on the participation in New York, I participated in particular on a forum around cities and around the collection of data to you know, be able to share good models quickly across borders. And one of the things that I think I took away from that meeting was an exchange I had with one of the staffers inside the Secretary General's office, who was talking about the difficulty national governments have sometimes talking to each other. And the example was Russia and the United States currently. And I said, you know, it's interesting because the mayor of Washington and the mayor of Moscow can have a conversation still. And cities have a global practice, and municipalities across international borders, within countries. Cities have a real capacity to share best practices and good models and new ideas very quickly, and can adapt them to each other, because human settlement is not radically different city to city to city. Countries, on the other hand, have a very difficult time doing it because they're rivals. And they get engaged with each other in a way that can sometimes be very damaging to the planet. And the member of the staff from the Secretary General's office said, well, what's your advice to us then? And I said, well, your advice is and the challenge you have is that countries don't like their cities very often. And so even though, you know, Toronto can talk to Barcelona about how to build a waterfront, or Montreal can talk to Vancouver about how to collect garbage more effectively, and other cities have done housing practices that easily translate from one continent to the next. Countries kind of guard their wealth and guard their geography and push each other away from one another, and as a result we end up with pretty catastrophic situations. And the challenge is that even within national countries, cities constitute this sort of power base that politicians, and you can see it here in Canada, they're kind of afraid of cities at the national level, and they kind of keep them in a very sort of parental, infantile state, in a kind of new colonialism in a way, and they keep them poor and they keep them at risk, and they don't like them talking to each other, and they're very afraid about sharing power with cities, even though cities are going to take us to where we need to go faster. And they said, well, the member of the staff said, well, how would you change that? And I said, I have no idea. I mean, it's you know, I said it's interesting to think that if one country were to go to war with another country, what they do is they blow up the biggest city first. And yet they intrinsically know that the power and the capacity of a country lies in its urban settlements, and as we become more urbanized countries around the world, as that happens, it shocks me that cities and that national governments don't understand that if the way to weaken your rival is to destroy their city, surely the way to build your society quicker and faster is to strengthen your city, strengthen the way people live and the way they survive in collective situations. And so one of the things that I took away from the UN meeting is that the UN needs to actually trust its cities to bring the global harmony and global movements together. And the UN needs to really support cities in a much more coherent way, in a much more forceful way, because that's where the common ground lies. It's where the higher ground lies as well. And that's one of the challenges we're going to have is getting the UN to deal with cities more than capitals.
Thank you, Adam. Selena, would you like to build on that?
Yeah, so I as well was at the high-level political forum in July, and one of the things I thought that I was going down there to do was to really promote our feminist international assistance policy, which of course I did with everybody that I ran into, but it became quickly apparent that there were a couple of things that really resonated or really sort of were salient points that came out of the meetings. Number one, and I'm going to repeat it again, I'm going to sound like a broken record, was the interconnectivity. Ensuring that we are not putting ourselves in silos. We had a great opportunity there and here. This morning I was in Toronto convening a group on the same subject of bringing our best minds together to come up with solutions to some of our grand challenges. We have to look no further than turning on our television every night to figure out that we are facing some really serious situations in terms of famine and flooding and hurricanes and earthquakes. So if we do not break down the silos that prevent us from exchanging ideas with each other, I'm not going to say there's going to be a problem. I'm going to say we need to use the opportunity to exchange ideas with each other to really affect some really great change. And we see that happening a lot in those types of meetings. Secondly was around financing. We need to do that differently. With the $7 trillion that it's going to take to finance the SDGs and the $146 billion that we have, clearly there's a gap. So how do we work with countries to ensure that that resource gap is eliminated? So Canada, of course, with Jamaica, has the group of friends, and we had a great meeting onto how we could look at domestic resource mobilization, look at ways in which we could leverage partnerships with private corporations in order to fund the SDGs, but also look at provide examples of what we've done domestically with our Development Finance Institute, leveraging different amounts of money to be able to then fund. One thing that came out of that meeting too, which I think doesn't quite get elevated in conversations, is corruption. Is the rule of law within other countries. So no matter how much money we put on the table, if the rule of law is not respected in a country, then we are going to have an issue. So it really requires us, I think, and this was where sort of we come in and leaders around the world come in, is to say, we need to respect rule of law. We need to ensure that we are getting aid and getting resources where they are needed. The third was communicating the SDGs, making sure that everybody is on the same page, talking to our grassroots sort of movements, or the people on the ground, the people in the trenches, in order for the universality of the SDGs to be a reality. We have to make sure that everybody's on board and we're all swimming in the same direction. And so that was critically important. Lastly, our young people. Our delegation was made out of civil society, municipalities, indigenous people, provincial representatives, federal representatives, and young people. They have really, really great innovative ideas. They see the glass as full, not even half full, it's just full. They have that power and that ambition that we have to give them the agency to create that change, and providing those platforms for them to be able to, again, they're all connected, to go back to the top and to to break down those silos and have them provide them the platform to be able to talk to each other. It's critically important. And I think lastly, in order for us to do our voluntary national review, it was really good to see what other countries were doing, and not just developed countries. Because as I said in the beginning with the Prime Minister, it was an opportunity to listen to the countries, small island developing states, to countries that are struggling. What are you doing within your very difficult situation to create some of that success? You want to look at those examples, because those examples of resilience, of coming together, of looking at innovative ways to find solutions to very big problems, is one way that we take those ideas. You want to write those down because they have a difficult path. So I think that the meetings allowed for that fruitful conversation, but there are still many other layers that we need to work on in order to really achieve the universality that you're talking about.
Thank you, Selena. I want to stay on the voluntary national review for a moment. I'll give you both an opportunity to answer this. Could you take our audience through exactly what that is and what it could potentially mean for engagement with the different sectors in Canada, the plural sector, the international development community, the corporate, et cetera?
So, as Adam said, we're somewhat, I don't want to say that we're somewhat behind, but we're somewhat behind. We're in a room of friends here. So we're somewhat behind. And I think I gave the example earlier where we've had 2 budgets where we are clearly doing some work domestically related to the SDGs, and we could have clearly identified those areas that we're working on. But the 2030 agenda is rooted in partnerships, is rooted in our capacity to stop doing things the way that we used to do it, to really look at breaking down those silos and leveraging the greatness in our private sector, in our civil society organizations to do the things that I mentioned before, to communicate, to help with financing, to engage our young people, to ensure that it's interconnected. When we present our review, we want to make sure that we are listening again and understanding what everybody is doing, not just from the top down, but from the bottom up as well. So I think we have a lot of work to do in terms of getting that ready, but we've done a lot of work. Now it's about connecting the dots and seeing where the players are and how much work they've already done to use the limited resources that we have to see what we need to do.
Thank you, Selena. Adam?
I think one of the things that's happened while the government has stepped away from this file in the last decade is that our university and college sector has stepped in and filled the void in many cases. And so one of the contributions that I think Canada is on the verge of making to this conversation is standardized data collection and data modeling systems that actually allow us to measure what cities are doing really well and what cities are not doing so really well, and compare cities, big and small, regional and national, across different borders, across different economies, in a way that allows cities to understand who's thriving and who's succeeding in certain areas and why. I'll give you an example. Guadalajara in Mexico has had an incredibly aggressive and successful campaign to eliminate youth unemployment. We know why and how that happens based on the data that they've collected and shared, because there's a new ISO standard that's come out of the University of Toronto that actually shows us what investments they made and where to drive youth unemployment down, and what investments other cities like Toronto didn't make, and as a result have high and really stubborn unemployment numbers with youth. We can also then take the numbers in Toronto and compare them to China, and take a look at a multicultural city with a more sort of national, sort of unified population, and understand how diversity plays a role in the way in which some of the programs roll out based on the way in which it is or is not accommodated properly. And it allows us to start in a very honest way measuring and comparing and realizing where our investments have to do more work or can do better work, and again share best practices or effective modeling across national borders. That's one of the areas where Canada can make a real contribution. But it's early days, and don't underestimate how difficult it is to invest more but change systems simultaneously. We have one of the challenges we face, and I know one of the issues that comes up is Canada's level of foreign investment, or Canada's investment into things like First Nations communities. If you suddenly just pour a lot more money into a broken system, you're going to create a lot more broken results. And accelerating and amplifying failure is not smart, and it's really not a good option, and we have to sometimes fix the system first before we turn on the taps to get the money flowing. And that's a large part of what we've had to do in the first couple of years. But I think we're poised to start turning on the taps now. We've also, found that with smart investments in things like housing and transit and better water systems, that we've also grown the economy very quickly, and it's given us additional resources to make those investments. So sustainable development and growth are not necessarily the most damaging things you might think they are. Sometimes they give you the resources to step into better systems and amplify and accelerate the good work you're trying to do.
Thank you, Adam. That brings me to the end of my questions. However, the audience is sending in a variety of different questions, and I wanted to give them the opportunity to have their questions heard as well. And I know you have a few minutes left, and we'll keep you on time. Selena, you mentioned the 17 goals. You mentioned universality. You mentioned their interconnectedness. There's also the question of relevancy. And in your opinion, if you could pick one or two goals, which ones would be the most relevant to Canada from a domestic standpoint?
Yeah, I thought you were going to ask me the question about aid spending. I got all prepped to answer that question. Like, what are you talking about, dude? That's not that question. Yeah, so I'll answer this. I'll leave that one for Adam. since people don't like him already. I mean, I'm the superstar here. No, just joking.
This is how she stays so popular.
Yeah, this is how I stay popular. Again, I'm going to go back to what I said around the fact that we cannot work in silos. This cannot work if we look at them one versus the other, one more important than the other. I think even if we're looking at our ocean protection plan, it really, and it's about life underwater. I think that's number 11 or whatever it is. That is connected in to everything else. So Canada has, and I think our government has taken a whole of government approach to many of our issues that we have faced over the last 2 years. I don't think it should be any different when it comes to the SDGs. I'm going to go to that first question though, because I don't think I could leave it when we talk about increasing aid spending. And so yes, I did say that it's 7 trillion. We have 146 billion in development aid. Leadership matters. It really does matter. And I'm going to give a quick story because I know I actually have to go. But maybe a few months ago, I was at an event where a young woman said, I have a cousin of mine who's, has a great family, got a great education in Pakistan, was able to, do well for herself, finish school, was going to go on to further education, and got married young. Was married, not maybe like at 24 when I got married, but younger than that. When her husband decided that he was done with her, she was gone. Changed, threw her out and the locks were changed. No matter how much money we put into a broken system, if we do not change the cultural norms around that system, what are we investing in? So we have to do it at the same time. And I think when we look at our feminist international assistance policy, we put women and girls in the center, but we also put around that 5 pillars: growth that works for everyone, environment and climate change, inclusive governance, and peace and security. Some of those things don't really involve a lot of money, but it involves leadership. It involves our capacity to say, this is not right. It involves our capacity to say, we know we have our own challenges. How could we work together to fix them? It involves saying, we have technical expertise in X. Let us share that technical expertise in order to be able to achieve our goals. So how much is leadership worth? What is the price tag on changing harmful social norms? And so I'm not running away from this question. I would love to increase aid spending, but I think we have to come from it from a very pragmatic and thoughtful process around how we, again, leverage the capacity of our partners and do things in a very holistic way.
Thank you, Selena. And I'm going to put one more question out there for Adam. And the question is to pick any one of the questions that are on the screen, Adam, that you're most comfortable answering.
Well, I'll go with, what is the government doing to ensure that Indigenous children are offered all the opportunities and protections held by other Canadian children? And I think this is a perfect example where there is great political pressure and appropriate political pressure being put on to building healthier and stronger and creating a future where Indigenous kids thrive the way all Canadian kids should thrive. And this is a perfect example of there has been a call, and I understand it, that we have to increase substantially the funding and get it to an equitable level. In Manitoba right now, there are 12,000 Indigenous children in foster care. If we were to give Manitoba a lot more money for their child welfare system, we would make a cruel system more efficient and stronger. And you wouldn't have 12,000 kids, you'd have 17, 18, 19,000 kids. 12,000 kids in Manitoba in foster care is more children out of Indigenous families than at any time during the residential school system in Manitoba. In fact, it's a higher total than all the children who were taken into the residential school system. We've effectively privatized and decentralized the exact same process and put them in front of 12,000 potential abusers, 12,000 potential people with no cultural capacity. And if you're asking me to put more money into that system because a court ruling has told me to, I'm going to tell you that system has to be fundamentally fixed with Indigenous leadership at the table directing us, and we have to change that and get to that circumstance very quickly. And that priority for Canada is extraordinarily important, because the file that I work most closely on, housing, when those 12,000 kids age out of care in this country, they're going to be on the street. We inherited a system from our previous government that said you had to be homeless for 6 months before we helped you. We have to change that, and we're in the process of doing that. But if we age 12,000 Indigenous kids out of care and drop them onto Winnipeg streets, or God forbid they end up on the east side of Vancouver and end up in harm's way, or if they end up in something else which we've just found out, which is that youth shelters are the central highest spot for enrolling kids into the sex trade, the highest spot of recruitment. If you ask the average person who's engaged in the sex trade in Canada where they first came into contact with it, it's in a government-funded youth shelter. These are horrible, horrible realities in this country that we can't just simply pour more money at and hope we get more youth shelters, pour more money at and hope we get more foster care, and pour more money at these problems and simply solve them because we've spent more on them. We have to fundamentally change the system. We had a very good consultation with academics and leadership out of the African Canadian community in Toronto. And the focus that they asked us to think about as we talked about a poverty reduction strategy was to rethink the way in which the African Canadian community landed in this country. They are not just another class of immigrants. They were brought here in a transactional nature as part of the slave trade in a colonial process, and they have been subjected to that process ever since. And you've got to start to think about a group of people living in Nova Scotia that have never been given title to lands they've lived on for close to 200 years. Sound familiar? So while we think about an anti-poverty strategy and reducing poverty, if we don't fundamentally restructure the relationship with the African Canadian community, in particular in Halifax and Preston and Dartmouth, but also rethink the way in which anti-poverty strategies work with different people who have been colonized and subjected to a different form of racism, if we don't rethink those systems, throwing more money at youth employment programs when that particular community doesn't have the capital, social, political core to its presence in this country, is not going to allow them to leverage those programs into better outcomes. And we have challenges, and we have to be frank about those challenges. And yes, more money for housing, you don't have a louder voice in the government and in Parliament, I assure you. More money for the development of programs to give Indigenous kids the best possible start and the best possible life in this country, absolutely. But the systems we've put in place and the systems we've inherited are fundamentally colonialist. That means they're fundamentally racist, and that means they have to fundamentally change as we also increase the funding to create different sorts of outcomes. And so you can measure some of these questions very simplistically. How many dollars are you spending and who's getting the money? But if you're not also prepared to have the deeper, harder conversation about are these systems working, you're not going to solve the problem. And what the Sustainable Development Goals tell us is to go down to the ground and talk to people with lived experience that are engaged in making transformational change happen with or without government support on the ground in communities around the world, and grow the change from there. And that's why it's so critically important from my perspective to get into cities. You know, most people, when they think about foreign aid, they think about, sort of irrigation systems for farms or drought-resistant crops or, sort of creating transportation networks to get people to and from one part of the world to the next part of the world. The reality is the bulk of the world's poor live in cities. The bulk of the work we're going to have to do in the next 30 years to achieve is going to have to be fix those cities to deal with the poverty and the degradation that happens. Poverty in cities is a climate change issue, largely displacement, but also the way in which we house people in low-income communities is usually really inefficient, really badly thought through. We don't build housing and transit and schools and economy all in the same spot to transform these neighborhoods and these communities. But the people who are doing that are the ones we need to start listening to and supporting and financing. But changing the system of how we reach those people is just as important as making sure we get the resources there. And so we've also had to, at the global level, as part of the Canadian government's action, rethink the way our embassies and trade missions have worked, because we inherited, again, a network of trade missions and embassies that were focused on the selling of resources, the transaction of goods, the negotiation of trade deals, and had very little to do with social, economic, or cultural development. And so reprogramming our embassies, our trade missions, our foreign policy, also has to be done before we start pushing more money into the system, because we don't want to replicate bad practice.
Thank you, Adam. So you've brought us to the end of our time, and I know that you have to run, both of you. But on behalf of the audience, CCIC and myself, thank you for your time, generosity, and honesty of your answers. And we look forward to future conversations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Keep up the good work.